Series, and I always tell folks when I do Bible class time, Bible classes are timed events, and so right, we've got a time period when we start and you stop, and so I want to make sure I get all the materials in. I'm sorry, my wife was with me today, and she'll keep me all collared up right, and make sure my jackets are straight, and at least today I won't have her for all week, so somebody else will have to tell me if my jacket's all crooked or something. They asked me whether I was going to teach from the floor or teach up there. I may be back halfway through the pews before I'm done. But anyway, I want to talk to you this week about this series of studies that I simply call, well, I didn't call, Paul called it, the Apostle Paul called it, a more excellent way. Just a tidbit of, to me, Bible study thought. Sometimes we'll look at a text of Scripture, and we'll isolate it from the context, we often say. We'll isolate it from the things that are written around it. And when we do that, we can make the mistake sometimes of actually having it mean or defined in ways that God didn't really intend. That maybe Paul had something in mind when he wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 13. When he writes about that, what we would often call, how would you define 1 Corinthians chapter 13? We would call it the what kind of chapter? The love chapter, right? We'd call 1 Corinthians chapter 13 the love chapter. But can I suggest to you that maybe a better way to define 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is the more excellent way chapter? Because throughout chapters 1 through 12 of 1 Corinthians, really what Paul's doing is he's saying, listen, you all divide over everything. You fuss over everything. You fuss over who baptized you. You fuss over who can be married to whom. You fuss over whether a man can have his father's wife. You fuss over everything. You have divided and created challenges. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, they're fighting over who has the best spiritual gifts. Which one of these spiritual gifts is the best among them? And they're fussing over that. They argue and are challenged over everything. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 31, let me talk to you about a more excellent way. Let me give you something to think about, he says, as it relates to how you might be able to resolve these things. And how maybe all of these challenges and difficulties that you're experiencing and all this divisiveness and strife that is among you, and as it relates to these various difficulties, maybe I can share with you a more excellent way that will help you resolve some of these conflicts. Now keep in mind, you can read 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There were issues with the way they were viewing marriage, and rightfully we could talk about those kinds of things if we wanted to spend some time in narratives like that. But this morning and throughout this week, I just want to focus on this kind of concluding kind of portion of this letter as Paul finishes 1 Corinthians. Well, he didn't write 1 Corinthians 12, verse 31. He didn't do it that way. But at the end of chapter 12, he says, but earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. Then 1 Corinthians chapter 13 starts. Then he begins to have this conversation about this love that God gets to define and how it is that it works in relationship to the various things. So this morning and throughout this week, just keep that in mind. That what we're talking about this week isn't just the love chapter. We're talking about the excellent way that the Apostle Paul describes and defines for us. How can I get along with my family members? How can I get along with my brethren and my church family? How is it that I can use this to avoid the strife, the division, the challenges that the church in Corinth was facing? Because that's the topic. That's the reason why Paul writes this portion of the letter. He isn't just trying to give us some information about love. He's trying to tell us this is how you resolve conflict. This is how you resolve the difficulties and the divisiveness that was occurring there in Corinth over any number of topics. And so for this morning's Bible study time, let's talk about this idea that love is profitable. And we're going to base that just out of the first 3 verses. Now we'll spend some time in some other text, but we're going to spend that time this morning as far as the theme based out of the first 3 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So read them with me if you would. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. And so the very beginning of this narrative, he basically has this contrast of how it is love can be profitable, and then the ways in which that we often ruin love and make it unprofitable by certain behaviors, choices, and decisions. And so let's talk a little bit about this profitability first. If you go into 1 John chapter 4 and verse 16, you'll notice a very simplistic phrase that is stated there in that passage. In 1 John chapter 4 and in verse 16, we note a very specific definition that is given to our Creator. If we have known, verse 16, and believed the love that God has for us, God is love. If you wanted to try to find a moment or a way to define God, if you wanted to look Him up in a dictionary and find a singular word that would define Him, there it is. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 16, he just simply says, God is love. He's the epitome of love. He's the definition of love. He is the example of love. He is all that is to be as it relates to this topic. But what I want us to appreciate from that is that if He is love, and we understand Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27 correctly, if He is love and we are created in His image, then we are love. If we are the express image of God in that sense that He's created us, if we bear within us that element of God that He breathed into us as He breathes that life into Adam and brings forth the privilege of being considered the creation of God. If I'm in the image of God, then I'm created in the same love that God has. Here's my point. Sometimes we forget that any behavior that is in contrast or in conflict with Jehovah is against our nature. Do you understand that? Anything that we do that is contrary to God is against our nature, because if we believe Genesis 1 and verse 27 correctly, if we are created in His image, then what we were intended to be, what we were designed to be, what we were created to be is the image of God. Anything in contrast to God is a choice against the very nature that God has given us. That is a crucial understanding of our relationship to the Creator in all kinds of matters. Our world mixes all that up. Our world has challenged itself in ways that it doesn't really need to challenge itself over this idea that we kind of get to define the manner in which we are designed and purposed. No, God created us. And He created us in His image, and He is the image of love. So all the anger, all the hate, all the strife, all the challenges, all the hurt, all the difficulty, that is all in contrast to God. God didn't choose it, design it, purpose it. Anything that fits in that mold, anything that fits in that descript, comes from some other source than God. It comes from the father of lies. It comes from Satan himself, who sets deceit and strife and sedition in motion. So I want us to appreciate the outset of our study throughout this week that God is love, and He created us in His image, and therefore by connectivity we are designed to love. We are designed and purposed to love, as God Himself demonstrates. And so I want us to appreciate that as we just kind of get some definitive thoughts put in place this morning in our study, that if our love wants to improve, and if we want the circumstances that we're involved in to improve through love, then what we maybe need to appreciate is that love is what allows us to define or put meaning to function. Why, it helps us to know why we do something. It helps us to understand not that we're just fulfilling some act or some duty or some responsibility. We're not obeying something just for the sake of obeying it, that there's meaning and purpose behind it. Let me share an example with you. John chapter 14. John chapter 14, beautiful text, by the way. We could spend we could just stay here, right? We could camp out here in John 14 today and talk about the things here. I just want to illustrate with it. John chapter 14, verse 15. Jesus speaking says, "If you love me, keep my commandments. And I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may abide with you forever. The Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. But you know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. I will not leave you orphans, I will come to you. A little while longer, and the world will see me no more, but you will see me, because I live, you will live also. And that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. He who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." Now let me pause. I'll read this couple extra verses in a moment. Did you catch that simple thought? What is the motivation to keeping the commandments of God? To keep the commandments of God and to obey the will and purposes of God is not by force, right? God has power to do that, by the way. He could have done that. He could have created us in a way that we had absolutely zero choice in the matter. He could have created us in such a way that there were no decisions to be made, no choices to be made, that he just put us here and said, "I'm going to puppeteer all of it. I'm going to direct you, purpose you, tell you what to do, and you're not going to have any choice." But that's not the way he designed us. He designed us as free moral agents that we're going to have to make choices and decisions. And Jesus says the reason why they would follow his commands, the reason why we'll stick to the relationship that we're building with Jesus is because we love him. May I suggest to you that sometimes we get the cart before the horse in relationship to that? And what I mean by that is we want people to serve and obey Jesus without loving him first. We try to get them to do things as it relates to their salvation. We try to get them to do things as it relates to their sinful behaviors and choices. We try to get them to obey doctrine without ever considering the fact that they need to love Jesus first. If you don't love Jesus, it's going to be hard to continue to do the commands, right? If we don't love him like we should, if we're not dedicated to him like we should, if we're not committed to him in the fashion that we should be, it'll be hard to maintain the commands. How dedicated have you been in life to the things that you really didn't want to do? Right? How good have you done them? I tell people I preach for a reason. I am not handy. Okay, so this week I'll be glad to do anything I could for you, but trust me, you don't want me fixing anything around your house. You don't want, right? I'm not handy. And when I get into projects that I kind of have to do because it's just, they don't generally get done very well, right? Because I'm not interested. I'm not dedicated. They're done simply because they have to be done. None of us do things very well when they just have to be done. But now pick something you love. Pick something that's of interest to you. Pick something that you have value in or you see the value in, and it just lifts you up, doesn't it? It's amazing how much better those tasks get done because of the interest level that was there first. My simple point, friends, is this. If you love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, you won't have any trouble with the commands. If you love Jesus in the manner that he desires for us to, you and I won't have any issues with whatever direction that he encourages us to follow. Because love improves all circumstances by letting us know why we're doing it. Jesus doesn't want blind followers in the sense that we don't understand or even examine why it is that he's desiring for us to be his followers and disciples. And Jesus wants us to know him and to love him and to serve him as a result of that. Notice what happened with Judas in verse 22 of the same text, John chapter 14. And Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? And Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. And my Father will love him. And we will come to him and make our home with him. You want a fast answer to why the world doesn't generally follow Jesus? The fast answer to that is simply this: they don't love him. That's what Judas asked the question. Judas, not Iscariot, asked that question there in that text. How is it that we can see this clearly, Lord, but the world can't see it? How is it possible that we can see it, but the world cannot see it? And Jesus says the simple answer to that is they don't love me like you love me. When you love me, then you'll see it. It'll be understood in clearer ways. You'll appreciate it more. And it's a very simplistic thing, but it's important. Love brings meaning to function. And it's a great motivator to keep us focused on the purposes that God has for us. And so then, if God is love, and it brings function or purpose and meaning to function, we're created in His image, then He gets to define what love is. I've just assumed trust the Creator of all things to tell me what love really means than what the world tries to feed us on a daily basis. I'd rather rely upon what God has given me to know what love really means than to trust in what other men have devised and created. And so that's the exercise for really this week in various ways. To let God define it. If He is love, and my job is to live in that image that He has created me in, then I'm going to let Him define it. He's going to tell me what the more excellent way is that is the pathway through love. And that's the study for the week. So you've gotten the premise. And so now let's talk about the details of the various things. And I promise that's the only connectivity that you'll have to have. Throughout the week, all the lessons will be independent of each other from that standpoint. You just have the benefit of that 15-minute premise to the study as we go through. But they'll work independently enough that you won't feel like if you missed one or somehow missed a portion of one, that you'll not understand the rest of it. So let's talk about this. So if love's going to be profitable, action becomes then beneficial when it's motivated, as we've already said, by this love. Go back to Proverbs 23 for a moment. Go back in your Old Testaments. In Proverbs 23 in verse 7. It's a familiar proverb maybe to you, but he simply says, for as he thinks, or as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Eventually the heart shows, by the way. Eventually the heart of every man will become evident. We can hide for a period of time. We can shelter certain things about ourselves and protect and put up a wall. And some people may not know the realities of certain things for a period of time. But the truth of the matter is, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. That's the real defining aspect of a man. It is not just the outward actions that you step into. It is not just the things that you might do in life that define whether you really appreciate love or not. And we're going to see that in 1 Corinthians 13 as well. But as a man purposes and thinks in his heart, family relationships should be shaped by the love we have for one another. Whether it be our physical families, whether it be our relationship with brothers and sisters in Christ. And I'll extend that even beyond that, even with friends and co-workers, people we associate with. Love can be a defining factor. Let me share what I'm talking about with you. When it comes to parenting, there is a tremendous profitability that love brings to the equation. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, Paul wrote, and you fathers do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. In Titus, Paul writes to him, let me just share the two texts with you and then we'll talk about them. But in the book of Titus, in Titus chapter 2 and in verse 4, when he spoke to fathers in Ephesians chapter 6, he speaks to mothers here in Titus chapter 2, when he says that they should admonish the young women to love their husbands and to love their children. So, fathers, love your children enough to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Mothers, love your husband and love your children in such a way that it will bring the proper benefit. Interesting side point, by the way. Paul, when he writes that to Timothy, he says, teach the young women to love their husbands and love their children. My thought is simply this. Sometimes we just assume that that is purely natural, right? We believe that that should be purely natural. It should just be all instinct. Not according to Paul. Paul said to know how to love one's husband isn't all natural and instinctive. There are aspects of loving your husband, he says in that relationship, that need to be taught and instructed. Things that can be learned. Loving your children, in some aspects, I grasp, is a natural relationship you would hope that would have certain instinctive elements, but not everything. Love, in other words, sometimes has to be taught. It's not all about that emotional infatuation kind of thing. Love in its purest forms, love in its definitive forms, are often education is necessary in order to draw the right conclusions. And if we want to be profitable as spouses, if we want to be profitable as parents, and if we want children to be raised in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, then love is going to have to be part of that equation. You add Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25 to that conversation. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25, husbands, love your wives. But he didn't stop there, did he? He defines it. He says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Husbands, if I could do it, raise your right hand kind of thing. You and I are the sacrificial ones, so says the Bible. That's exactly what Paul wrote there in Ephesians 5. My love for my wife is sacrificial. My love for my wife is in such a way that it's in the pattern of how Jesus loved the church. Well, how did Jesus love the church? Oh, well, he went to a cross and shed his blood to purchase it. Now, don't stretch the picture too far here. We're not talking about purchasing wives. But what we're saying is that my love for my wife is a sacrificial kind of love. I think there's a lot of husbands who struggle with loving their wives properly. They, at times, only see that authoritative side of the equation. They only see that structure that God has given as it relates to the relationship between husbands and wives. And they forget the very specific instructions that Paul grants here in Ephesians chapter 5 when he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Let me illustrate that to you. How in the absence of love, conflict can come up. I know a guy. Well, I know a lot. But I know of a guy that was traveling, and in his travels, he was speeding. He gets pulled over and receives, I believe it was something like a $70 speeding ticket. That probably dates that, by the way. It's probably much more now. So he gets the $70 speeding ticket. He's got it in a glove box as he continues his travels. While he's traveling, his wife calls him, and she's crying, and she's upset. He finally gets out of her, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And she said, "I locked myself out of the house, and I had to call a locksmith, and it cost us $20 to have the locksmith come and let me in the house." he derided her for 30 minutes over the $20 for the locksmith. How irresponsible that was. How irresponsible of her to not remember to have her keys. How awful it is for her to be so irresponsible that she would lock herself out and cost them $20 with a $70 speeding ticket in the glove box. I'm trying to illustrate to you folks that husbands, when you love your wives, you're the sacrificial one. And your authority in relationship to that relationship doesn't absolve us or allow for us to treat our wives in such ways that in the absence of love and appreciation. It's embarrassment to think sometimes of how men confuse their purpose and their relationship, and they've left love outside of the equation, when the Bible clearly teaches us that it needs to be in the equation. 1 Peter chapter 1, let's talk about families. I'm cautious, and I'll make this comment now. I'll probably make it a couple of times before the week is over. But sometimes if you do a series of study and it's all about family, and when I say family, physical families, then sometimes if you're not married or if you don't have children or if you're in those kinds of situations, you go, right, I don't need this. And so I'll hit it. I'll hit a point about physical families, and I'll talk about church family, and I'll talk about other things. So there'll be something for everyone in all the lessons. That's all I'm trying to say. So here's 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22. Now we're talking about God's family. Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. Our relationship to our brothers and sisters in Christ is so vital in the purposes and cause of Christ that He just defines for us here in this text that we need to be loving one another. And do that with a pure heart fervently. What I'm trying to appreciate is that we may fall prey to the idea that we give fake or feigned love to our brothers and sisters in Christ. We try to have a perception that we love, but when we talk about them and we say things and we create challenges and we cause fuss and fume and strife within the body, do we really love? Are we really allowing for that profitability of love to govern all of these various relationships? And certainly within God's family, the same principle of love that we've been talking about is just as important as it is in the physical families. But lest I run out of time, let me move forward and talk to you a little bit about this continuing thought that he had in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Because he said there's benefit to love. It's the more excellent way. It guides and leads us. But notice, he said, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. My wife's a band director. I dabble in teaching percussion, not so much now as maybe years ago. But anyway, I've heard a lot of clanging cymbals. I know what they sound like. If you ever watched a child, our children are so deprived. Remember when I'm 52, so anybody 52 or older, you remember metal trash cans? Anybody remember metal trash cans, right? And you remember they would take those metal trash can lids, the kids would, and they'd walk around the neighborhood, and what would they do? Whack, 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 whack. Playing the cymbals. Well, you're all looking at me like, Brian, you lived in some kind of weird neighborhood. I don't remember any of that happening. You ever tried to have a conversation with a clanging cymbal banging around in behind you? It's not easy. My point, friends, is simply this. You could have the ability, Paul says, you could speak with the tongues of men. You could speak in every known language to man. That's what tongues are. They're not gibberish. Tongues are languages. You could have the ability to speak in every language known to man, but if you don't love your fellow man, you might as well just be quiet. though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. You're just noise. I'm just noise. If love isn't the motivating factor behind what I'm saying, if love isn't the reason and purpose behind what it is that I'm trying to convey, the knowledge that I'm trying to share, the information I'm trying to lead somebody to understand, if love isn't the motivating factor, God tells me that I'm just a clanging cymbal. Even though there may be levels of brilliance or even spiritual gifts behind it. Because words without love can be harsh. I fear, I'm this. Anytime you make a statement like this, somebody says, "Well, who's he talking about, or who's he trying to accuse this of?" I got no one in mind here. I'm just sharing a principle with you. We have fallen prey sometimes that being right is the primary, and if I can love along the way, then that's okay too. And may I suggest to you that those two things are never disconnected. They're never disconnected. How I speak, what I say, how I say it, the manner in which I approach people, all of those things are relevant. Yes, truth has to be spoken. Yes, what is right needs to be declared. Yes, we need to encourage people to know the truths and the values of the Scriptures, but never in the absence of love. I can't disconnect them as if one needs to be done, and if I happen to get the other in the mix of that as well, then that's great. No, the Bible combines them and says they need to be working hand in hand, and they'll have a greater effect. Again, if my words aren't motivated by love, I'm just a couple of trash can lids banging away. Proverbs 14, verse 17. Proverbs 14, verse 17. A quick-tempered man acts foolishly. You know how I know that proverb is true? Because that's been me. That's how I know that's true. I guarantee you, every time I have acted hastily, harshly, quickly, or with a short fuse, I guarantee you foolishness followed. I literally have the scars to prove it, by the way. I was a teenager. My mom was babysitting a young man who locked me out of the house. You don't lock me out of the house. So I decided I would beat on that door so he would know he can't lock me out of the house, but I shoved my hands and my arms through the glass. Why? Because I was angry that I got locked out of the house. And you know what the Lord has done for me? And you might say, well, Brian, how do you know? Well, okay, I'll give providence maybe here. But you know what the Lord has done for me over the years? That spot on my left hand, I've got scars on this hand too, but that spot on my left hand, if I bumped it against this pulpit right now, my entire arm would go numb for about 5 minutes because of the nerves that are exposed in there. And I honestly believe that's the Lord reminding me, don't do that ever again. Your quick-tempered moment has now cost you some pain some 40 years later. I'm still reminded of that moment where I let quick-temperedness rather than love motivate me and I acted foolishly. Nothing good ever happens in the absence of love. I believe that's what the Proverbs is trying to teach us. Foolishness happens, harm happens, hurt happens, difficulty happens, not good things. And a man of wicked intentions is hated, he says there at the end of that proverb. Friends, when we act without love, we will be harsh, we will be ill-tempered, we may very well become hated according to the text. We need to be careful that we're not behaving and making choices and decisions that are leading us into destructive paths. Within families, I had one father share this with me. He said, Brian, he said, I knew I was acting too harshly and too abruptly and too quick-tempered around my children when I was asked this. Can you imagine a child asking their father, why are you yelling all the time? What has you so frustrated and so angry and so upset nonstop? Daddy, why do you yell so much? Oh, you want to talk about had to have been a humbling moment, I would hope. A humbling experience to realize that that was the image that his children had of him. Not somebody that loved them and cared for them, was nurturing them and admonishing them and encouraging them. But they had a dad that yelled all the time. And I'm a dad, I get it. I'm not standing before you saying I've never yelled at my children. I guarantee you if I tried to say that, they'd find their way to Austintown here in the next hour or two and tell you that that ain't true. But I'm not proud of it. And you can't make a pattern of it. Because eventually my children will look at me like a clanging cymbal, and I don't want that. My children are all grown now. They're all, boys are both about to complete their college. Well, one's completed his college degree already. He'll finish his master's degree here in a couple weeks, and the other will finish his undergrad in a couple weeks. My daughter's at West Liberty University. They're all older now. But I would hope that if they have a challenge or a problem or some difficulty, something they would need some advice or some help with as they're adults, that they would feel comfortable coming to their dad and to their mom and asking those questions and looking for some resolve and some assistance, because I wasn't a cymbal in their ear all their lives. That they knew the love that their mother and their father had for them that now allows for conversation and assistance and help to be provided because the relationship was built. Brethren need to be cautious. Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Paul wrote to those in Colossae by saying, let your speech most of the time be with grace. Any challengers? That's not what it says. That's the way we'd like it to say. That's the way we would like to practice it. That's not what it says. What it says is, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. You know what I think a mistake we make with Colossians 4 verse 6 is? We look at Colossians 4 and verse 6 and we think that we need to know what to say to people. That's not what he said. He's not talking in Colossians 4 and verse 6 about the what. He's talking about the how. That let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that we would know how we ought to answer every man. Now, friends, you've already heard me to say today, truth has to be taught. You can't put truth aside and hope everything will be okay. And you can't ignore what the Scriptures teach. And I get all that. But I can't ignore what Paul said here, that when I speak the truth of God, when I speak about what is right and wrong according to the standard of God, that grace needs to be in the midst of that every second of the time. And the way that I communicate and the how I communicate to my brethren, to those outside of the body of Christ, to anyone that I have conversations with, that they would see the grace, that they would see the speech that is seasoned with salt, which would simply just make it more palatable. You know, we can, information can be conveyed in all kinds of ways. And you can take the same fact and share it without grace, love, and kindness, and it'll mean one thing. Share the same exact piece of information with grace, love, and kindness, and it'll convey a completely different message. We need to be cautious. How much love is seen in me? Do people appreciate that when I'm trying to communicate truth to them, when I'm sitting down with Bibles open and we're trying to have a conversation about what God's purpose and will for mankind is, that they know that I love them? That the grace that is being evidenced in the way that I'm speaking and talking is allowing for them to appreciate those things as well. Because if love's not part of that motivating equation, if love's not motivating the way that I act and function, then back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, even the purposes and wisdom and faith that I have are now being tarnished. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Did you catch that? I could know the Bible from Genesis 1 to the end of Revelation. I could quote it frontwards, backwards, sideways. I could give you everything and anything you wanted to know about the Scriptures at any moment in time. But if I have love, or don't have love, I don't have anything. I'm nothing. I could have every ounce of wisdom that there is. I could have all the right answers. You know the problem is? Sometimes we can have all the right answers, but none of the love, and nobody's listening because of it. I could have all the knowledge that would really help and benefit people. I could have understandings about God's Word that would really encourage and uplift and be beneficial to folks, but because I don't have enough love within me, I'm nothing. That's strong language, but that's what the Apostle Paul said. I'm nothing. He could have enough faith and confidence in God to say to that mountain, move over there. But without love, I'm nothing. Without it, I tarnish the wisdom and faith that I have. And friends, I'm convinced that instruction and the sharing of the knowledge that we have has a tremendously more potential benefit when love is the motivator. Run to Proverbs 13 and verse 1 real quick. In Proverbs 13 and verse 1, when he says, a wise man or a wise son heeds his father's instructions, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. And we talked earlier about the idea of when we build that relationship with our children, then they'll want to listen. They'll want to hear that instruction that we're offering. Being that spiritual rock and foundation that can encourage others, and they're not exclusive. I think sometimes we think that. Now I'll be cautious, but I've heard people say, I've heard them say things like that. I've heard people say that because I'm preaching on 1 Corinthians 13 this week, I'm weak. They're not mutually exclusive. You can tell the truth and still love people. You can speak what's right and still love people. They're not mutually exclusive. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and cumin and all these other spices, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. You can do them both. Jesus says, you don't have to forfeit something in order to make sure you get these right. I can be strong in my convictions. I can be a champion for truth. I don't have to vacate love in order to accomplish that. And our families need to know we serve God out of love for Him. And that He desires that we love others as well. I think one of the greatest things that we can do as parents with our children is to make sure that everything we do spiritually, they understand the meaning and purpose behind it. They need to know that we don't just go to church. Because someday they'll get old enough to go, why did I go to church all those years? All I know is that Dad made me get up every Sunday morning and we went to church. But Dad never told me why. Mom never talked about why. Our families need to know that we serve God because we love God. We honor Him because we love Him. We love Him because He sacrificed and blessed us and aided us and helped us. There's reason. There's reason behind it. I'm concerned that maybe the church is reaping what we sowed. And maybe we sowed a time period where we just told people this is what you're supposed to do. And never told them why. Never explained to them why it is that I wanted to serve God. Why it is that I understood the benefits of serving my Creator. There's a whole host of other things. My time's up today. There's other things we could talk about. This will be, by the way, I'll warn you ahead. This will be all week. I'll get to a point where I'll realize, all right, you've absorbed all you can absorb, and we'll move on. And I won't be able to get all this material done. Here's what I'm going to offer you, though. At the end of the week, I'll bring a copy. I've written this series in booklet form as well. And so if you're interested in that, when we get done, you say, boy, I wish he would have talked about this or that. Maybe I did. I just didn't get to it in the sermons. And so I'll share that with you if you're interested in that. Just let me know. But for now, I appreciate the time we've been able to share in our Bible study hour. And we'll, here in just a little while, switch gears and talk a little bit more about kindness and patience as it relates to this topic that we're dealing with this week. Thank you.